This is Ross Coulthard, and you are listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and joining me for his third appearance, our now joint record holder on the podcast, you can see him on video, folks, is author and remote viewer. You might remember him from our previous interviews discussing resonance or remote viewing. I have Simeon Hein. Sim, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Andy. Great to see you for the first time in one of our conversations here.
Yes, it's and Dan is going to really appreciate this one, because if you're watching on YouTube, it's already set up for YouTube as well, so less for him to do in terms of editing and stuff. So hope everyone enjoys this, and I'm looking forward to it because Sim, you've got a new book out, Dark Matter Monsters, Cryptids,
Yes.
Ball Lightning, and the Science of Secret Life Forms. You are very well prepared. There you go with the picture of it too. Really interesting book, and I was saying to you before we hit record that I love the way it's written, because an idiot like me can understand some really difficult topics that you're presenting, and they're presented really clearly and really well in a way that I go, okay, I can see how that's connected to this, but I've got a lot of questions for you, and the audience did too, so I want to get right into things. So at the beginning of the book, in the preface, you mentioned as a child your mother read you the book Where the Wild Things Are by Morris Sendak, and that you knew this was a story and it wasn't real. But in the real world, there are monsters out there as we know them in these tales. Do you believe that over millennia and over centuries, many of those tales that we now think of or know as fantasy are actually rooted in truth? But the storytelling and changes in society, we've kind of lost that connection to what they once were.
Andy, that's a great question. Again, thanks again for having me here today. I have been thinking about that question as I wrote the book. Obviously, those of us who grew up in modern societies, who are around our age group, you would have been taught that those childhood stories were just fictional or anecdotal, maybe even metaphorical. You know, they're not really real. And I've always walked around in the woods, in the forest. I've hiked throughout the United States, especially now that I live in the West, most of the time by myself. I've backpacked out there, many of the national parks. I've been there with groups, and I've been there by myself. And I really never thought twice that there could be anything more dangerous out there than perhaps a poisonous snake, a bear, perhaps a mountain lion occasionally. I'm talking in my part of the world in North America. And I've never encountered anything other than bears or snakes and things like that by my own personal experience. But I think your question is really a good one, because what I think has really gone on here is that, is that a little too loud?
I mean, that's pretty noticeable.
I'll keep talking. Let's forget about it.
Yeah, go on.
Doesn't bother me. So that's exactly what the conclusion I've come to, Andy, is I think what happened was these creatures and cryptids, as we call them, these are sort of hidden types of life forms that science hasn't fully recognized yet. What I think has gone on, and I feel even myself in middle age here that I was unprepared for this, even being associated with UFO topics, studying remote viewing, being involved with this community, I wasn't prepared for the truth of what is really out there. What we did as a society over centuries is we relegated these encounters to stories, and then even kind of glossed them over, sugarcoated them a little bit to make them appropriate for children. And we called them children's stories. And so, just like you're saying, we'll read these stories to children about big hairy monsters being out there. And I'm not saying that all Bigfoot are monsters. I don't want to imply that they're all dangerous. It's far from the case. But the genre as a whole, the whole topic of cryptids, where we do have a whole variety of encounters, it turns out that they're really out there. And what I think has gone on is our collective psychological defense mechanisms have kicked in to push them away, so that even people who've encountered these creatures, they either won't remember it later they'll push it out of their minds as something that never happened, or it'll just turn into something that's sort of an unknown so that we don't talk about it. It's just so far off the scale. It's beyond, almost beyond UFOs, because we're familiar with lights in the sky. We see planes, we see objects, we see satellites. We see the International Space Station come over. So we can sort of, isn't that kind of weird? We can put UFOs and UAP into a category of things that are seen often in the sky, though they're seen on the ground, as we're all aware. There are trace cases, and it's a whole big subject too. But that sort of fits into the area of objects in the sky that are unidentified. But we don't even have a category for anything the size of Bigfoot, for example, in our experience, our realms of experience, to kind of say, well, it's kind of like this, maybe like a bear, but a lot bigger. It's so beyond what bears are like that it doesn't fit that category. Your mind wants to turn just the Bigfoot side of cryptids into maybe an escaped gorilla. And so that is, I think you're correct. We took these experiences, and because we can't process it, it doesn't fit into any category unless you go back thousands of years, perhaps, to the Bible. It doesn't fit anywhere. So we just say, well, it's a childhood mythological story, and we tell it to children. And then for people who've actually encountered these life forms, whatever they turn out to be, the closest thing that you could associate them with is where the wild things are. Yes.
Just a quick note on the noise. It was a chainsaw that was on outside. That's should be stopping anyway, folks. We didn't just ignore that. Sim wasn't.
I can hear them packing up right now.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll just keep going anyway. But that was really
no
interesting. You mentioned about, there are these things potentially that we can't see or can't understand, even UFOs that we do see, but potentially we don't understand, or we can't categorize properly exactly what they are or where they're from. But even then, there are things around us, like you say, we can't see and we don't understand. But there are things around us we can't see, we do understand. Like, I know that I have Wi-Fi on my phone because a signal is coming from one location to my phone and giving me the internet. But I understand on a base level how that works. So there's no scariness there. Whereas if someone had just invented some really basic form of radio, and they picked up radio waves that were bouncing around the sky, they might not know what they're from or why they're there, but they have an idea that something is causing a reaction. And I wonder, is it similar with some of these objects and entities and beings, that they drift in and out, and we sometimes pick up the signal because of a scenario or a place or a time, and it just happens to be, the right environment for that to happen, and that's why you get a crop circle, a Bigfoot sighting, a UFO sighting, a ghost sighting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and on a couple different levels. On one level, we cannot really talk about things that are not part of the known very well. So what we do, and this is something that sociologist Dr. Ron Westrom of Eastern Michigan State University has pointed out many times. He did this with his study of meteorites, Ernst Friedrich Florence Chladni, how, meteorites were originally considered to be like peasant folklore back around the 1800s. And it wasn't until Chladni and a number of other interested scientists, as they were called back then, maybe natural philosophers. I'm not sure how they would be considered at the time, but we would call them scientists now. Now, meteorites were considered folklore. It was not considered to be real. It did not fit into the Aristotelian paradigm. And Aristotle believed that there was nothing in motion beyond the moon. The moon marked the boundary of where things happened for us on the earth, because the earth was the center of the universe. Beyond the moon, there was no activity. The planets were thought to be mounted on huge crystal spheres that sort of orbited around us, but they were considered static too. So the sublunary area was considered where everything happened. And because meteorites did not fit into that thought process at the time, that cosmology, they weren't considered to be real. And I don't think we're any different, Andy. I don't think we're any different now. What Ron Westrom pointed out is unless we have some known category that's considered socially acceptable, we can't even talk about these phenomena. And that's why meteorites were considered peasant folklore for the longest time, until there were some serious studies and huge meteor showers around, I believe, 1802, 1804, where there was just so much evidence that it was overwhelming. And they stopped throwing away the meteorites from museums as they were. There are no old meteorites past the 1800s because they were all thrown away from museums. They were considered to be volcano stones or stones that were thrown up from lightning strikes. So it's our current paradigm that allows us to start branching out into the unknown. And with this topic, it took me even the longest time to sort of see it as being real. So what I'm wondering is, like you're saying, is it the right moment and the right time that someone's picking something up? They're just at the right place and they're open to this for some reason. It's often little children while hiking with families that see them first. You could walk by one of these creatures and not see it because it's not in your mental vocabulary. We're all familiar with that concept of inattentional blindness.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen this demonstrated many times at the types of conferences and seminars that you and I would go to, UFO conferences and so forth, that the way our brain works is we filter so much out. There's that famous film that I think came out of that research at MIT where you see basketball players in black or white T-shirts,
yeah,
and a gorilla comes across, and you don't. I didn't see it. I was in a conference. I believe it was in New Mexico, Albuquerque area, and they said, "Okay, just watch this. Count how many times the balls are passed between the black T-shirts and the white T-shirts, and you do not see the guy in the gorilla suit." I didn't see it myself the first time, and they say, "Oh, watch again." I think only a couple of people raised their hand having seen it. Maybe 80% of the audience doesn't see the gorilla. So how likely are we to see something that we don't expect to be there? If you talk to witnesses to these phenomena, they'll often say, well, they thought those sounds were just ordinary animals and the howling was a little weird, but maybe it was an owl or a coyote. You see, you fit it into what you know.
Yeah.
And then maybe it was a bear. Except when you go back and look at the prints, they're human-like prints that are way too large. So a lot of it has to do with what our sensory apparatus has been, used to perceiving over the course of our lives. And you're certainly not going to bring in children's stories into that. This is a very challenging topic for everyone. It's, Andy, this is a lot closer to us, the topic of cryptids, than even UFOs and extraterrestrials for many people. Simply because you do not expect these to come up to your house if you live in a rural area in North America. And you have them in Europe, and I think you have them in the UK too, though there may not be as common. You don't expect these to kind of come up to you in a space where you feel like you're sort of the apex predator, as we've been taught. We've all been taught that we're the most developed life form. We're the most developed intelligence by our culture and by our religions that we're part of.
So just in the title of the book, cryptids, ball lightning, signs of secret life forms, we know there's Bigfoot, UFOs, and other phenomena discussed. Where do you even start piecing together how these different phenomena are connected when you're looking to put together the book?
What I'm looking to do in Dark Matter Monsters is there are underlying phenomena that people encounter, whether it's a Bigfoot encounter, it's a UFO encounter, it's a crop circle encounter, and even to some extent RV, because we know that Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ told us that when Uri Geller was at Stanford Research Institute, he was their first test subject before Pat Price or Ingo Swann. Mm-hmm. As many people are aware, he was in the U.S. for 6 weeks. They encountered cryptids around their homes. This idea of a hitchhiker effect is not new, but if that's the right way to think about it, I mean, people picked up something from being around Uri Geller. Now you have to think about this for a second. They saw giant crows at the end of their beds inside their homes with windows closed. They saw different types of little UFOs and creatures and things like this. This sort of effect we've heard associated with Skinwalker Ranch goes back farther than Skinwalker Ranch. It goes back to SRI, is the oldest date I know about it, associating something like you would think not associated, remote viewing, resonant viewing, associated with seeing cryptids, strange creatures, things that don't fit in any categories we're used to.
And that's just like an exposure to something else, that other, and it opens up the door.
Right. That's how I think about it. And so this is why these topics are all connected. And we had this Twitter question. You probably saw it in the feed. Someone said, well, why in the world would you connect Bigfoot to UFOs? It's because people see them together. They see them around the same time period, the same locations, even getting off of UFOs. Sometimes in these waves, as I mentioned in my response to the tweet, in Stan Gordon's book, Silent Invasion, and his research into southwestern Pennsylvania wave of UFO and Bigfoot sightings, it all happened at the same time. So what this suggests to me is that there's some sort of fundamental underlying principles here at work that no matter which of these topics you're interested in, it's going to lead you back to the same sort of phenomena. Now, in the past, I've looked at parallel realities, multiverses, and that is one larger theoretical explanation for what's going on here, is that once you start opening the door to any of these phenomena, you're opening up several doors at the same time. You're going into other rooms that you haven't experienced before, where there's other phenomena that your culture didn't prepare you to believe was real. But concretely, to answer your question of how I dealt with it in Dark Matter Monsters, the book, I'm looking at the phenomena that are associated with coherent matter. And those are all the same phenomena, whether it's ball lightning, sudden temperature changes, anti-gravity effects. Those are all features of coherent matter. The literature is pretty well established in this, but for a variety of reasons, since the advent of what we call cold fusion, and it goes back before Fleischmann and Pons at the University of Utah, back to the 50s to a researcher named Winston H. Bostick, all the way back to Tesla. And then it goes back, as we've learned from George Egli from Hungary, Dr. George Egli, who also researched. It preceded Tesla by a number of decades. So World War I seemed to have really stopped a lot of the research. Some of the researchers were killed and so forth. This goes back to pre-World War. We're looking at alternative forms of matter that are associated with ball lightning and the whole phenomena that's the characteristics of ball lightning. But for whatever reason it is, whether it's a conspiracy, which I'm not really, a firm believer in, not necessarily a conspiracy, we as a Western society have pushed away all of this research that we associate with Nikola Tesla. We've pushed it away, and we pushed it away when Fleischmann and Pons came up with their result in 1989 at the University of Utah and had a press conference, because that's what their university, they didn't want the press conference. The university did. They wanted patent rights. You have to show prior knowledge. Okay, so then they get this huge blowback against cold fusion. And it even goes up in our country to the level of the federal government, where George Bush at the time senior has a presidential commission on cold fusion, and they hire MIT to look into it. And these guys say, no, we can't reproduce it. And a lot of people couldn't, because they didn't set up the experiments the right way. It's a pretty finicky, it's a particular reaction. It can be kind of finicky. For a variety of reasons, we pushed this away. But all of these phenomena, Andy, I'm convinced, at least that's my point of view here. I'm willing to look at alternative arguments. What we call paranormal, almost everything that we call paranormal is a relative of coherent matter, period. A type of condensed matter where you get alternative types of interactions that you normally don't see with just normally gases, liquids, and solids, or even plasmas. Something beyond it.
I'm going to come to ball lightning, and I'm glad you talked about coherent matter phenomena, because that's something I'm going to ask you to dive into soon. Sure. I want to know, though, Bigfoot, for many people, is likely one of two things: a species of ape-like creature that we haven't really encountered or categorized here on the planet, or some people, like you say, have seen them coming off of UFOs. They are from different dimensions, realities. They slip in and out, and they're here sometimes and then they're not the next. In the book, I think it argues that both of those could be correct, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive, do they?
Exactly right, Andy. These are not mutually exclusive categories. The way we think, it's got to be this or it's got to be that, right? It could be entirely a terrestrial species, a type of either relic ape or a type of relic human, a hominoid. But it's been here so long that it's evolved to work with these natural principles of energy that we're just rediscovering and called cold fusion. These cold fusion principles are just already built into nature. And we know that from, the work of Dr. Takeaki Matsumoto. This is in a book that just came out this week, too. It's the same time as around my book, about the steps to discovery of electronuclear collapse. Now, I won't go into all the arguments there, but if you read his book, he says that what we see in cold fusion is already what we see going out in stars, in black holes, neutron stars. It's just a small scale version of what we already see going far away in the galaxy. And so if that's true, these are fundamental principles that are built into nature. And it's not surprising, really, if you think about it, that there be life forms on Earth that learn to incorporate these into their biology and chemistry, so that they have what seem to us like paranormal abilities. And so the answer to the question of whether it's an ape or a human or an extraterrestrial, it's some sort of combination of all of that. And I'm not doing that as a way of escaping the question. It's just that what people report, and I got this is so surprising. When I started going to some of these Bigfoot conferences, and some of them weren't very far away from Boulder, Colorado, because this is an area in the Rocky Mountains where people have Bigfoot experiences. And when I went to my first conference in Bailey, Colorado, nearly every speaker that got up said exactly what you just said. First, I thought it was some sort of relic primate, and then I thought it was an undiscovered human. And then I finally realized it's some sort of paranormal human. So these researchers were the ones that I was listening to them, and I corresponded with them later, who told me about their paranormal experiences around Bigfoot, things like levitation, time, space, dilation, brain fog, all sorts of weird effects that you sort of associate with UFO contact or extraterrestrial contact. It's the same thing that's happening around Bigfoot. Your cameras and batteries stop working. You start feeling confused. You may have a couple hours of time loss. All these weird things. This was the most surprising thing to me, Andy, is that all of these phenomena that I had associated with UFO encounters and experiences that people have in crop circles, which have a UFO link, it sort of made sense there. But Bigfoot, why would you expect Bigfoot to have the same sort of effects on people as a UFO nearby? And the reason would be is that it's dealing with the same sort of fundamental scientific principles underneath, which is some sort of gravitational changes, gravitational collapse at a nucleonic level, some sort of changes in space-time, even similar to what Hal Puthoff has talked about in the conferences I've heard him present. He calls it space-time engineering. And the people in the cold fusion area, and that's Hal Puthoff's and other physicists who work with him, that's his explanation for how some of these UFOs create propulsion, is their space-time metric engineering is the name for it. Actually changing the space-time field. Well, the people in the cold fusion area, going back to Soviet research that we've been able to locate even in the past couple of months, call it vacuum engineering. Vacuum engineering. I think space-time metric engineering and quantum vacuum engineering are the same thing. And that would mean that we're dealing with the same principles. And that's how I link these phenomena together. And even at a phenomenological level, the symptoms are the same. Again, sudden temperature changes, kind of feeling that things are weird all of a sudden, memory loss. It's the same sort of symptoms. And I think it's because it's the same sort of principle.
It also sounds very similar to some of the things we hear happening, as you mentioned in the book Skinwalker Ranch, where you hear about dire wolves and strange, huge humanoid type creatures coming through portals and such. And we've now got some very serious scientists and studies, again, like you mentioned in the book, George Knapp, Colm Kelleher, James Lakatsky's book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, talked about the OSAP studies and what happened at the ranch as well. How connected do you really think all of these things are? Are they loosely connected, or do you think they're far more part of one greater whole than we would imagine?
Right. That is the question. I would say they're connected, not loosely, not overly tightly, kind of somewhere in between, a medium level of connection. They're all tapping into some of these same fundamental aspects of quantum vacuum changes, where the fundamental constants that we're used to staying very constant, like electrical capacitance, magnetic permeability, things that are kind of some of the fundamental constants in physics. There are about 20 of those constants. The fine constant you might have heard of. There are all these things that in our day-to-day life, our section of the cosmos, those constants are the same. But if you create variation in electrical capacitance and magnetic, what's called permittivity, magnetic permeability, you get immediately changes in the speed of light, because the speed of light is based on permittivity and permeability. So our experience as modern people, it's probably the same for me in the US as it is for the U and the K. Same fundamental 20 constants in physics, right? And this is something that Max Tegmark pointed out in his book, The Mathematical Universe, Our Mathematical Universe, about why he believed the multiverse interpretation of quantum mechanics was the most direct one, the one that's most likely, is because if you change any of those constants, you could easily create alternative realities in the same space-time that we're in right here. We might not even interact with the life that's in those realities with just slight changes to any of those constants. It's in his book. So when you look at the phenomena that happen out to Skinwalker Ranch and other areas, Skinwalker isn't the only one. In their first book, The Hunt for the Skinwalker, Keller and Knapp mention 4 or 5 other locations with similar sorts of phenomena going around. One of them was right here in Colorado. I don't know the exact location, but they gave it as being in Elbert County. And then we had where the ESETI Ranch is on the east side of the Cascades in Washington State. And then some of our listeners, viewers here may have heard about Marley Woods, Ted Phillips' study of Marley Woods, a ranch in Missouri that had the same phenomena, even more extreme sometimes than Skinwalker Ranch. So you have these locations where you have these phenomena going on. Again, you have UFOs, UAPs. We've seen it at Skinwalker Ranch in the TV series, or you can read James Lukatsky's, excellent book. I see you have a copy of it right there.
For the viewers, yeah, that's
yeah, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. Now, initially when I saw that, Andy, I thought, what that could be about? What kind of title is that? You read it, you see they encounter these werewolves, these dark objects that emit a lot of cold and create a lot of instant fear. It's even almost impossible to approach them, which people have, researchers who've been around Bigfoot have said the same thing. You'll hear where the sounds are coming from. You literally cannot walk closer than a certain distance, which is very similar to what those 3 DIA analysts recount with that sort of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, black hole-like object on the path ahead of the. Yeah. So these really do seem connected. Now, I don't want to be the one to say these are all exactly the same thing. I'm not a reductionist. I'm not trying to explain this away. To answer your question, I know I'm being kind of long-winded about this. I think that the life forms, the technology, and the physics around this suggest that these sorts of types of life are tapping into the same frequencies that we get around ball lightning. And I'm not saying they're literally the same thing, but they seem to be part of the same reality. They do seem to be part of the same reality at these various portal locations, whatever you'd like to call them, where these phenomena happen. I'm sure it's other parts of the world too, but maybe we haven't heard about it. Maybe some of the governments don't want to share the information about this. I mean, the fact that you have the Defense Intelligence Agency looking at Skinwalker Ranch as a possible national security threat. If you've listened to the people we've heard on various podcasts talking about Skinwalker Ranch, they did suggest that maybe some of the activity there was being caused by other governments or something, because there were injuries to the researchers. I don't know if that's true or not, but you can see the type of thinking that's going on in the heads of the people out there. So I think there's a lot more research that's gone into this than we found out about. And even Lakatsky says that it was such a hot potato at the Pentagon for OSAP to be looking into dogmen and Bigfoot-like creatures at Skinwalker Ranch that they couldn't get any more funding for it, because it goes back to your first question right at the beginning of our conversation here.
Yeah.
It's just so off the freaking charts of what we consider to be real. It doesn't fit into the bureaucratic organizational schemes of modern society that are run by committees and have to have annual funding and so forth. It almost can't fit into one of those committee meetings because people won't even know how to talk about it. It might be too scary to them or too traumatizing to want to talk about. And we have to consider the possibility that it brings up experiences they've had that they don't want to think about, having a picnic with their family in the woods. I mean, as Lakatsky tells us, they saw these cryptids back in their yards, back in Maryland, when they came back from Skinwalker Ranch. Well, maybe other people are experiencing it too, and you just don't even want to go there. So you're not going to get funding for it. So end of discussion on the subject. And that's what we're dealing with, is something beyond our current paradigm, to the extent that we're simply not good at processing it, even at an individual level or at a group level.
It's like levels of understanding where even those conversations you have with friends and family about UFOs, okay, I can have that conversation. Well, what if they're not from space? All right, okay, I'm listening, tell me more. And then you start to talk about different realities, dimensions, different entities, and different, spiritual beings, and they might still be in the conversation. And then you try and get to a point where you have that umbrella phenomena to say, what if Bigfoot, ghosts, cryptids, fairies, all these angels and demons were all one and the same sort of phenomena, and tie UFOs in with that, and it's just too much for people to get to that. And it's like, at what point do people have that natural tapping out? And I think that's where a lot of the, as you say, the scientists and academics who are trying to approach the subject, they still have to do it at a very basic level, because there comes a point when you do apply for funding and you say that we're going to go after, dire wolves that are crawling out of portals on a ranch. That's probably a couple of steps too far to secure X amount of millions that you want to actually investigate it. So you pull it back and you pull it back and you pull it back. And that's the same again with any of those kind of conversations. I do want to ask you a question though. In your research, do you think that when it comes to Bigfoot and those types of cryptids, is witness testimony still the best evidence that we have that these creatures exist?
Yes, and it's a very good question, because in social science, we consider this to be exploratory research. Social science is a little different than the hard sciences. You're going to just start with something called exploratory research, where you don't have any metrics. You don't even have the definition. You're going to look at the topic and see, are there some basic categories? Is there a way to talk about it intelligently? And so you're going to rely on witness testimony, anecdotal research. Now, what really struck me, people will say, well, it's just anecdotal. But you're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of anecdotal reports of people who've never spoken to each other before, who are encountering the same thing. And this is what struck me looking through all the Bigfoot encrypted encounter stories, is that people will say exactly what someone else said from a totally different location in terms of what they experienced. One example, sudden quiet that comes over the forest before the encounter. Even the crickets will stop chirping. Now that's really weird. Why is that? I mean, when Bigfoot comes around, is it like the squirrels and the birds say, hey, the big boss is around, we got to be quiet? Or is it a vibrational resonant change that they just feel like, oh, there's a predator around, we should be quiet? But what about crickets? Why would crickets? So someone suggested to me this could be true, that it's some sort of space-time shift where the sounds are not getting to your ears. Maybe the forest isn't quiet, but you're sort of in a different space and you can't hear it. Or they really are getting quiet because they're sensing something that's triggering a defensive mechanism to hide. From a coherent matter perspective, it's like another type of matter is sort of entering your area. And for whatever reason, those animals. So people who but again, going back to the commonalities, isn't this what we hear often happening around UFO encounters? For example, Terry Lovelace, who I mentioned in the book, author of Incident at Devil's Den, Many people are familiar with his story of going to camp with his Air Force medic buddy, Toby, in one of the Arkansas state parks. And they were just outside the boundary, but right close to the park. Well, if you reread his book, Isn't It Devil's Den, he says they're sitting in the tent. And then I think he says to Toby, hey, isn't it pretty quiet out there? Oh, no, Toby says to him, isn't it why is it so quiet all of a sudden? The crickets went away. And I think Terry says back to Toby, oh, don't worry, they'll come back. Right before this huge triangular craft, really huge, comes down. And, it's hovering over the field. The next thing they know, they're back in their tent. Hours are gone by, and they have memories of being right there. They have memories of being inside the triangular craft, and not particularly pleasant memories. So again, is that sudden quiet around Bigfoot and Dogmen and other cryptids? And there's a whole host of cryptids, by the way, more and more rare as you go along, but people report these experiences. Is that type of sudden quiet the same as we get around the UFO sightings? I'm assuming because people say it's the same sort of thing, it is. I mean, it could be something else, but seems to me like the same sort of phenomena.
On a quick side note, I'm in contact with Terry Lovelace just now, and he should be on the podcast in September. We're just waiting a week or two, but that's nice timing mentioning that one. And I noticed he was mentioned in the book a couple of times, and his books are obviously quoted. On that idea of society having this discussion and conversation, and do you think we are there yet in 2022 as a society that people en masse are ready to accept and study dark matter monsters in a serious way and accept that they're actually part of our reality?
It's going to be a very big step, isn't it? Even for me, it's a very big step. But the evidence points to the reality that they're there. They're out there. They can. It's the same sort of thing we're going through with UFO reporting to Congress in the U.S. with the National Defense Authorization bill that is renewed yearly. And this time we're told, just even as 2 weeks ago, when I think it was passed by the House, there has to be a pipeline, a classified pipeline, where the Defense Department has to report back to the House and the Senate committees, I guess the intelligence committees, the ones that handle classified material. They are demanding that they report anything related to UFOs and UAPs. They don't want it kept secret anymore. And that's because all these pilots that we've heard about, at least from the Navy side, we don't know, again, why the Air Force is being so completely quiet about this, though we can hypothesize. But yes, and you've talked about this on the show and but the Navy, we've talked to had the witnesses on, people familiar with this material. People like Lou have heard the classified side of it, which the rest of us haven't. The Congress has said, we're done with this. We want to know what's going on. We want, and I think the NDAA mandates that anything that Department of Defense knows about this topic must go to the House and the Senate to, be discussed. So, are we ready for it? I think we need to be ready for it, whether we are or not, because we're not going to grow and mature as a society and be able to handle the challenges that we all face as a planet without having these discussions. And whether it's just about UFOs, as Elizondo and Mellon have talked about, where they feel like we need to have a national discussion for our own, the structural health of our society, because we're having pilots and all sorts of people having experiences with this, which they're, because of social stigma, they don't talk about it. And we don't get the information, and it could have national security implications. Well, on another level with the cryptids, it's the same sort of thing. If people are being traumatized by their encounters, and having talked to these witnesses, and I mentioned some in the book, people I've known just around this area in Colorado. It took 20 years to get one of these witnesses in the book to tell me a story that I didn't even put in the book. Just a couple of weeks ago, I said to this guy, I need to hear this story. What happened to you out there? It's when he was camping by himself. And he was so traumatized by this that he never talked about it, even to me, and I've known him for so long. And so if it takes 2 decades for someone that I've known pretty well, who I met through one of my RV classes, to start talking about it. I mean, it's a big deal for people to admit that this has happened, that they've been frightened out there in the woods by something they can't identify. That's a big step. It's a big step with UFOs, I imagine, for people in the armed forces to talk about it too, because, you know, when I asked one of the witnesses from the Nimitz incidents, when I talked to him on my YouTube channel, how many people in that carrier group knew about these Tic Tacs and had been talking about them, he put it in the thousands. That one Nimitz aircraft carrier, I don't know how many thousand are just on the aircraft carrier, and then in the whole carrier group. But he said, even though we've only heard maybe 20 or 30 witnesses and we've had more come forward recently, I mean, he put it at thousands would have been talking about it. In the Navy, it would have been called scuttlebutt.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. So the scuttlebutt's going around across the whole carrier group. But he said of thousands that would have known about it, maybe 20% of the whole personnel on the carrier group, you've only had a small fraction come forward and talk about it because of the damage it could do to their career, promotion time, so forth. Many things could inhibit your promotion when you have some sort of review in the military, if you talk to people who've been in the military. So if, you know, and this is what Congress said in the UAP task force report, right? Is that sociocultural stigma. So I think that applies to all of these topics. I think we've really been scared, Andy, of publicly talking about it. Not you and people who you've had on the podcast. It's opening up. It's obviously opening up. And this is a subject that affects a lot of people. But the really interesting thing is the more you talk about this, the more witnesses will contact you one way or another and say, you know, I heard you talking about this, or I saw you, you know, your YouTube video. I had an experience like this too. And they've never talked about it to anyone before.
I'm hoping people, you know, given you talked about that attention test earlier on where the gorilla walks across the basketball court, and I've talked about that on the podcast before. I'm hoping people were so engrossed in what you were saying that they missed the beeping there as one of the trucks were leaving with the chainsaws. So maybe they've missed that paying so much attention to you. Apologies for that one, folks. So just a quick one. Did you happen in the last week, Simeon, to catch Gary Nolan on Tucker Carlson? So that was really interesting because Gary Nolan's a really fascinating character. I spoke to him on the podcast a couple of months ago. He's going to be coming back on in the near future. And he was happy to sit there and talk about potential injuries related to exposure to UFOs, UAP.
Yep.
Do you see in the research you've done and the cases you've researched any similar types of effects from exposure? And you talk about those kind of space-time bubbles or vacuums, whatever it is, people are entering in those quiet spaces. Anything similar to do with Bigfoot, ball lightning, and other types of exposure?
Yeah. So the Gary Nolan interview, I mean, I love the part, just as an aside, where people have said to him, as they've said to many people in professional levels, don't you think this might hurt your reputation? I mean, I started listening to the interview this morning, very early this morning, because I just saw it last night.
Yeah.
So I love his response, Nolan's response. He goes, that is my reputation to go against the grain. That's what I do. It's like, you know, what he's saying is like, science isn't a popularity contest. You don't do it to get likes on your Facebook page. You do it to pursue the truth, make sense of the data, and see if you can figure this puzzle out. And he's dealing with these injuries from UFOs, UAPs. We've heard about this. And in Dark Matter Monsters, I mentioned the NICAP study from 67, I believe. Major Donald Kehoe and Gordon Lohr. And they put together about 100 cases of weird effects around UFOs, the ones that we're all used to, but just to read them again, it's so classic. It's so interesting, right? The sense of confusion people have around the agitation to animals, the types of injuries that they get, burns and so forth. So I haven't been actually able to medically examine anyone who's been around Bigfoot, but just talking to these witnesses, I don't know if it's the same types of injuries as UFOs, but there are physiological effects that in the Bigfoot world is called brain fog, and it's been attributed to infrasound. Infrasound being those very low vibration sounds that various animals can make. I mean, whales use infrasound, I believe. Elephants, very, very low frequencies that really broadcast out to a distance to other members of their species so they can communicate across these long distances. And people feel that Bigfoot uses this type of infrasound to hunt, and that they occasionally use it against people too, which might be true. But we do know from the literature around coherent matter, and ball lightning's one type of coherent matter, based on my research, that there are serious injuries and even deaths around coherent matter. People who've participated in cold fusion experiments have had injuries right in their lab. There was one very famous incident from Joseph Papp when he gave a demonstration at Caltech of his one of his devices. I forget what he called it, but it was a cold fusion related device based on HHO gas, oxyhydrogen gas, which has a condensed aspect to it. And Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, went up on stage and pulled out the grounding wire. The grounding wire was there to channel these charge clusters in a safe way back into the electrical system through the ground, which is what we all have on our equipment. And Feynman thought it was a type of cheating. So he pulled out the ground, and Papp was, very insistent that he reattach the ground wire. Feynman refused to do it, and there was an explosion, and one person was killed and 2 were injured. And there was a lawsuit that against Feynman for doing that. So that's just one early example we know, just even from the 60s, where there were injuries around this type of matter. Now, we're talking about an entirely electromagnetic effect there. Even though an explosion, it's not like we're not talking about gasoline explosion there, Andy. We're talking about an electromagnetic object decohering in an unstable way. Well, if you look into the literature about ball lightning, there are occasional injuries to animals, to people. They can explode. They can do all sorts of things, and they can leave. In the Lakatsky book, there's an example of these orbs of a father and a daughter. He mentions driving through the Northwest. Yeah, and then the daughter sees these blue orbs come in from the right and go, and this person sustained injuries from that. Now, I can't prove sitting right here and from the book that wasn't something else, but that is consistent with charge clusters, exotic vacuum objects, and ball lightning, that they have unpredictable effects when we encounter them. It's admittedly a rare phenomenon. I haven't encountered it myself. Well, actually, I have. In around Knapp Hill in '98, I was with a fellow looking down at a crop circle in the East Field. It's a huge field where circles have shown up. And I did see a small orb. He saw it too. So I knew I wasn't just making this up. Yeah. He saw a small orb off to the right. Just lasted for a few seconds, typical of ball lightning. It looked like it was sort of getting fed energy from the ground, the way it was modulating. I did see that. But these can have unpredictable effects. And so I would say that perhaps some of the injuries that Nolan is looking at are not just due to exotic technologies from advanced craft, certain electromagnetic frequencies, or even, ultraviolet bluish light that can cause burns. It seems like what Nolan was talking about there are more severe than just injuries, because one of the witnesses I interviewed, Gary, who worked at Minot Air Force Base in the 70s. And I've talked about this before, and I have his videos on my YouTube channel. I mean, he talked about him and his buddy in the security alert truck were burned by this UFO that they see near a silo. They're sent out to find out why the alarms keep going off. And he said, it was so bright, you couldn't even discern a shape as it vertically took off by the silo. And they were burned. The whole side of the Jeep was discolored. He said even their rifles, their M16s, were discolored on the right side. And I think, was it Jim Peniston who suffered the same injuries at Rendlesham Forest, or John Burroughs? John Burroughs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is part of these phenomena, and whether they're exactly the same remains to be seen. But it's part and parcel of this territory, is that many times these types of objects and even creatures are not harmful in the least. Even ball lightning can just evaporate and nothing happens. But there's cases where it also can be quite There's a lot of energy there. It can explode. It can discharge electricity. And it seems to me, Andy, that a lot of what they saw at Skinwalker Ranch, maybe even are seeing right now, it's not any different than what we saw around ball lightning. Now, it may not be exactly the same thing because it's not coming from, thunderstorms which generate ball lightning. It seems to be coming out of the ground or just associated with the area. But the symptoms are so similar from the destructive effects of coherent matter ball lightning that I just have to think it's the same sort of thing. In other words, it's not necessarily an entity intentionally hurting people and livestock, the incidents with the cows and so forth, the cattle. It's not necessarily an intelligent entity using these energies to injure people. What I'm just saying is the ball lightning does this on its own, and it's so exquisitely sensitive. If you read books about ball lightning, like this book by Russian researcher Bychkov et al., very extensive treatment of the history of ball lightning goes back to, these people have researchers have looked at all these studies, all the injuries around it. It's very similar to what they're talking about. So unless, we can show it's an entirely different phenomenon that's intentionally doing something to people, I would have to say that these ball lightning is so sensitive to its environment, it actually looks like it's following you. It's following your electrostatic signature. And I'll tell you one more thing about this, Andy. When we were out in the crop circles for, about 2 decades, I started looking at them in 97. We would find our static meter would be extremely sensitive to the shape of the crop circle. In other words, the electrostatic charge was really affected by the shape and the distance of the ground. So it just seems to me that makes sense that ball lightning also can be, if I could measure it with a meter, it's not surprising that this type of matter would also follow, its way through open windows and doors as people see it leave, go down the aisles of aircraft. It's not because, I don't think, it's because it's intelligent and it's following its way down the aisle like we're walking. It's following that electrostatic gradient. So when I hear this happening at Skinwalker Ranch, and I'm happy to be proved wrong, but when I hear this happening at Skinwalker Ranch, following animals around and doing things, it could be the same thing. It's just following gradients. That doesn't mean that there aren't life forms that are also tapping into it at the same time. I'm not trying to explain it all the way. I'm just trying to say we shouldn't assume that there's an entity there that's doing this.
What about, no, that's totally fair, and it's good to look at both sides of it, but
Yeah.
what about the potential that the ball lightning itself is some sort of life form, or, could it be like a hint at a plasma-based life form?
Well, I don't think we can ever rule that out. That would be very interesting to discover that. And it's something that I've thought about a lot is, does some sort of intelligence, has it tapped into the ball lightning in a way that it can direct it in a certain way? It's an open question. But the ball lightning itself forms anytime you get really compressed coherent matter. Coherent meaning same frequency, same temperature. The electrons will become one big electron. The electrons, if that's what we're dealing with here, the charge cluster will compress. And there's a researcher who worked with Hal Puthoff named Kenneth Radford Shoulders, who worked at SRI, even back in the early RV program, who was a real pioneer in microelectronics. And he passed away, I'm sorry to say, from injuries due to his research in compressed condensed matter, because it can create radiation and so forth. But Kenneth Shoulders did a lot of research in this area, and others. And I think they've shown us, Matsumoto, Alexander Parkhomov in the USSR and now Russia, they've shown that when you get really compressed matter, these electromagnetic forces overwhelm gravity and are the predominant force. And they literally compress particles, subatomic particles together, that there's transmutation. The particles lose their identity, what they had before, and become like one big coherent particle. In the case of ball lightning, one big coherent, one electron, a macro electron, the same sort of thing before they come apart again. And so, to answer your question, I'm not sure it necessarily it's a good question, and I'm not resolved on this one way or another. I'm not sure it needs intelligence to do what it does, but that doesn't mean that types of life haven't tapped into it, because there's a saying from the Miwok Indians of the Yosemite Valley in California. Their saying is, wherever a Bigfoot walks, a lantern follows. Wherever a Bigfoot walks, a lantern follows. And that means that there's an association between an organic type of life and this ball lightning, these orbs.
In the book, you mentioned that ball lightning tends to be relatively small in size, where you also talk about many UFO reports. They'll talk about objects the size of football fields, huge craft. Do you think that leans towards ruling out a correlation between UFO sightings and ball lightning being confused for each other? Or is it just a different part of the puzzle to solve?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, UFOs seem a lot bigger than you ever see from ball lightning. Ball lightning averages, maybe a few feet across. It can be smaller. And in the case of the cold fusion, it can be micro ball lightning. People have seen these little ball lightning, Matsumoto especially. This is how they kind of saw there was a connection. In their cold fusion experiments under scanning electron microscopes, they saw little ball lightnings moving around and on the surfaces of palladium metal and so forth. But certainly there's a point at which it's not going to be ball lightning anymore. I don't know what the limit to the size is, 10 meters, something like that. And again, it's a good question for investigation. I don't totally know the answer. Are these UFOs, UAPs, are they generating something like that type of coherent matter that we recognize as ball lightning? Certainly there's got to be a difference, and certainly when you get to a certain size. But in the nightcap report from Gordon and Lohr, they talk about these orbs and balls of light. And going back to John Ramirez, the former CIA signals analyst who made the podcast circuit not too long ago. I don't know if you had him on this show, but
John Ramirez, a couple of times,
Yeah. So he talked about this, and he said that he's talking about this quite openly. He said that he believed that these orbs, which they could see coming into the atmosphere through the keyhole satellites, highly classified satellite system, which Ramirez told us we could look up in Wikipedia and get a lot of the basic, which I did. They enter service, I believe, in the early 70s. So he said these keyhole satellites were picking up in the infrared range these orbs coming into the Earth's atmosphere and being interested in nuclear test sites and related facilities. He said that they saw these over the Soviet Union. They initially thought that these might be some sort of Soviet counter defensive measures. Remember him saying this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah.
Well, the real interesting thing about it is he said that they concluded that these orbs were a type of UFO. That, in other words, we think of UFOs as solid objects, right? In a large sense, right? Like a metallic craft or something. I know Jacques Vallée has tried to push us away. He said, look, they're not little guys getting in their metal craft coming from other planets. But Ramirez is suggesting, I think he's saying it pretty explicitly here. Correct me if I'm wrong, that these orbs and UFOs are the same phenomena. So in that case, these orbs would be sort of a different state of matter of these UFOs. And he even went as far as describing them as dark plasmas. Do you remember him saying that? Dark plasmas?
Yeah.
So that gets into the era we know of coherent matter having an invisible form, sort of a dark form, some people call it black ball lightning. So I guess what I'm suggesting, Andy, is there's a spectrum of phenomena here. And I certainly haven't in my own mind come to a resolution of what is it that's UFO? What is it that's ball lightning? What is it that's orbs? I guess what they're on a spectrum of intelligent control and then something that just seems to be a physics phenomena, but there seems to be a relationship between them, which is really intriguing. Really intriguing.
I want to get some listener questions because some of the things that I would have jumped in with, people have wanted to ask you, and I'm going to leave that up to them. So let's get to some of these. The first question was from Paul. You answered that earlier on. That was the one you answered on Twitter when you talked about the connection between UFOs and Bigfoot. So thank you, Paul. Wanted to give you a shout out for that one. Simeon brought that one up. Newman always sends in some good questions. Newman asks, how does Simeon rationalize the reported overlap of alien visitations with appearances of entities that seem to come from an afterlife? And he says that Whitley Strieber, for instance, reports that together with his wife, he encountered grey beings as well as what appear to be ghosts of deceased relatives during a contact event.
Well, I think we're going to come to the conclusion, whether it's 5 years from now or 100 years from now. I don't know how long it's going to take. I think we're surrounded by a lot of different forms of life. Just what we've been taught is just wrong in school. We're taught in biology classes and science classes that there's this tree of life, and somehow we're at the apex of it, right? And it starts with sea life, and it kind of singular cellular organisms, and ends up with us, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
I bet what we recognize as life right now is 0.1% of the life that's around us, even in our own galaxy. I mean, we know just from dark matter alone, the study of dark matter, and this, we haven't talked about this yet, Andy, in our conversation so far, is that 99.5% of the matter and energy out there is invisible to our sensory systems and all of our equipment. It can only be detected gravitationally. Even the other type of matter that's similar to us is considered non-baryonic, which means it doesn't interact with light. So even in our own universe, we know that we're only seeing like 0.5%. So even if we look at the James Webb Telescope images, which are beautiful, and the new ones that are coming back, like that Pinwheel Galaxy,
Yeah,
right? It's just like, wow, if that doesn't make your day, I mean, just beautiful. Well, that's only 0.5%, folks, of everything that's out there. So is it really that far-fetched to think that maybe we're only aware of 0.5% of the types of life that are out there, and not all of it is physical? Some of it is in the energy realm. It's not far afield from relativity theory, general relativity theory, which says E equals mc squared. And what is Einstein telling us there? Is that energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. That energy, and it's even hard for us to, I mean, just talking about it right now, Andy, it doesn't seem like, well, there's mass, there's physical things, and then there's energy things that are making our conversation possible, and lights and stuff. But yeah, Einstein told us, 100 years ago that energy and mass are the same thing. And then quantum mechanics tells us that everything has a frequency in relationship to a constant called Planck's constant, that it's not continuous. Well, again, as Max Tegmark gets into his book, Our Mathematical Universe, and Hugh Everett, before him in the 50s as a graduate student at Princeton University, the other way to look at that, because of Planck's constant, is you have all these parallel realities stacked up next to each other at different frequencies. And as much as it is a blow to your ego to think that you're perceiving everything, none of us are. There was an article in Science Magazine just yesterday I was looking, saying that as humans, we only see a very narrow spectrum of the electromagnetic frequencies that are out there. Different animals are all specialized based on where they are in the earth, in the oceans, in the atmosphere, of seeing different frequencies. We're just not seeing as much as is out there. So I don't think it's really a stretch to think that there's other life that is just not easily perceptible, or may even be in frequency ranges that we don't perceive directly.
And if that other life had developed a technology which allowed them to change between the frequencies, they can pop in here. And that's why you see them for a split second, for a few minutes. Then why they look hazy, grainy, hard to take photographs of, hard to film. And then they go away. And that's it. They're just jumping back and forward like a radio station. And we don't have that ability.
Exactly. And the listener's question is, why do we perceive them together? Well, once you start perceiving other frequencies, maybe your just ability to perceive more and more frequencies opens up, and you start perceiving the frequencies of spirits and other life forms, whatever you want to call them, ghosts or things like this. Maybe these are versions of us at different frequencies, people that have passed on that we knew. Maybe they exist at different, that's bleed through from other realities. I mean, it's not hard to think about it that way. And so for me, getting involved in RV, I've often said that was like a gateway drug, because I came into RV as an open-minded skeptic. In other words, I was open that it could be real, and I thought maybe it's not real. And I'll take a class like I did in '96, and we'll see. Well, it worked. Yep. Turned out it worked. It really worked, and I got results. There's no way this has any conventional explanation. You're describing something you won't see for half an hour, and here you've drawn it already on the page. How could that be? It starts opening you up to questioning lots of other things. You start seeing more because you're relying less on your senses and more on your intuition. And so that kind of takes you on a pathway to see more and more of what's going on around you. Well, I think it's the same way with people who've had UFO encounters or so forth. I think it kind of opens the aperture. I mean, that's the analogy that Ingo Swann used. We probably start off with a pretty open aperture, but being socialized into the societies that we grew up in, it's kind of narrowed, become practical adult people, and our aperture perception gets kind of shut down. But
Yep.
through training like RV or experiences, or maybe even near-death experiences, the aperture opens up and you see more. And you see more of what's really been there the whole time.
And same with psychedelics, as I've discussed psychedelics with Dr.
Also.
Andrew Gallimore before, and he talked
Yeah.
about various different things. And again, gateway drugs they're called gateway for a reason, because they're opening up that door to something else. So, but yeah, really interesting. Okay, this name Slarty Bartfast is really hard to say with a Scottish accent, but I think I got there. Slarty just said, "Could you tell us more about time slips and time anomalies?"
Now, that is an entirely fascinating subject in and of itself, but I'm sure it's related to what we're talking about, Andy. And again, I don't claim to have all the answers. We're just looking at the evidence here. I have friends who've had these time slip experiences. They literally went into a town, felt that they ate in a restaurant, which when they went back the next day had been shuttered for 2 decades. And everyone said, that's exactly where we were. And if you read this, Terry Lovelace, ask him about this in his a sequel book, Devil's Den: The Reckoning, where he collected 30 of the best stories that were sent to him after the publication of his first book. He has some time slip type stories in there. And what a time slip is, for people that are not really familiar with it, it's where you're at a location and all of a sudden it changes into something, could be in the past, is very common. These have happened in London and other places, where you're all of a sudden on a street that shouldn't exist anymore. It's lit with gas lights. The stores have all different names. And it just changes into a different place. Sometimes it happens to groups of people together, and then they all come back. Most of the time they come back. If they don't come back, I guess we don't see them again. I've talked to people who've had it happen right here in Boulder, where they're walking down the street and all of a sudden they're horse-drawn carriages. They're looking at barns and a gravel, dusty road, and they come back. There was a time slip conference I participated in a couple of years ago, where Preston Dennett was one of the presenters. I listened to his time slip stories of people who've encountered UFOs, where they've been taken back to their past or seen things that they didn't exist anymore. So the time slip phenomenon is really, I think, quite an interesting feature of this. Now, when you talk to people who've been around UFOs and cryptids, this is also part of their experience sometimes, where they feel like they've changed space or time suddenly, and then they're back where they are. To me, that suggests that, again, some connection here, right? I don't want to be too rigid about it, explain it all away, a unified theory of all this. I don't have that, but there's obviously a connection, or you wouldn't have it happening when people are taken aboard a craft and they're taken into another time on Earth. They're shown the future, or they're taken back to their past. They see the cars of their friends, real specific details that could be verified later, that couldn't be faked. They know things about friends that the friends never told anyone about. So does that suggest to us, again, this is just one possibility, that these parallel realities are all stacked up next to each other, and what we call the past and the future is different places in this matrix? I mean, that's the way Ingo Swann thought about it. That's why he called it the Matrix. And we've had that movie that comes out of that idea, that what we call time are different frequencies, and that perhaps when you reach a certain state, or other entities have figured out how to do this, you can move along that space-time continuum so that you've moved into what we call the past or the future, something like that.
I think in the last year or so, hearing that in relation to the abduction experience for me makes a lot of sense. That people would ask, why would your grandfather and then your father and then you and then your children have tabs kept on you by an alien species over 100 years? That's a long time, but maybe for them it's half an hour, that they can check your grandfather, your father, then you, then your kids, in the space of what is a very, very short period of time, but they're just jumping forward as they go along, and they're able to keep tabs on the genetics, so that same length of time isn't the same for them as us.
Right. And you just reminded me of something I'd like to mention. People have had those space-time slips around crop circles. I mentioned the case of Ron Russell being in one of them in Avebury in 94. It was kind of this scorpion formation, kind of scorpion eating its own tail. It kind of looked like that. I think I have the picture. Yeah, the picture's in the book. And Ron has told me this story many times, and I just spoke to someone I happened to run into from this area yesterday who was there at the time, and she confirmed it. That Ron had gone out to his car to get more film or something like that, and he encounters people who are speaking an old dialect of English, dressed in medieval clothing, who seem a lot shorter than we are, in the wheat as he's going out to his car. He comes back and feels like he's been gone for maybe half an hour or minimum hour max.
Mm-hmm.
And the people back in the circle say you were gone for less than 5 minutes. Something about the shape, the helical pattern of the crop circle is changing the electromagnetic structure. And again, this is in the Soviet research, and even research from Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, I believe, SLAC, David Freiberger, about how electromagnetic fields can have different arrangements. They call it diality rotation, but it changes the structure of space-time, exactly what Hal Puthoff is talking about. If we were experiencing that, would we experience one of these space-time slips? It's a really good question.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, really interesting.
Question from Frederick. Frederick asks, what does Simeon think of Bigfoot encounters mentioning psychic powers such as Les Stroud's? And also separately, what about genetic manipulations? Could humans or Bigfoot be the product of such?
Great questions. Really great. Now, I'm really glad he brought this up. Who is it, David?
It was Frederick.
Oh,
and you know what? I could have totally stolen those questions, put them into the interview and claimed them as my own. But those, as with many of the listener questions, deserve to be heard from the listeners.
Yes, no, that's excellent, because Les Stroud is one of the things I'm listening to. Les Stroud, he had a show called Survivor Men Bigfoot. Now, for those who don't know who Les Stroud is, he does survival. He's a former, I think he did landscape surveying in Canada, if I'm not mistaken. And he did all these shows on survival. Loves being outdoors. He loves teaching people how to survive and how to set up tarps and how to eat there. It's great stuff, right? It's really a lot of fun going back out to nature. Can you survive out there with very little man-made things? Well, he encountered hoops and howls and trees falling over that shouldn't be falling over during recording that of Survivor Men. And he even went back and showed us some of the footage where he's out in the water, and he says he hears ape-like sounds coming from the woods. You can see him looking on the camera. He said that's how he got interested in the Bigfoot dubbing. So he did Survivor Man Bigfoot, and he experienced some of this telepathy, which the listener is bringing up. Now, he experienced this around Portland, even to the extent where he went to see a psychologist later on to see if he was cracking up, hearing voices talking in your head. Well, it turns out that this is an experience that Bigfoot witnesses say they have. Obviously, they don't talk about this to many people, just like Les Stroud probably wanted to see a shrink before he started talking about this. They hear Bigfoot talking in their heads, in their homes. You listen to Wes Germer's Sasquatch Chronicles. He's over 800 episodes now. Many of them are free. You can listen on YouTube, and you can be a member and listen to some of them that are not up on YouTube or on his site that are open to the public. But you hear people talking about this. Episode 841 is an example. The woman, and she's not the only, I've read about this so many times, before the people encounter the Sasquatch, and they have lots of different names, based on where you are on the planet. Here we call them Bigfoot because of someone who gave it that name in 1958. Called them Bigfoot. They're big prints out at Bluff Creek. But people hear this before the physical encounter. So Andy, Dan was in my RV class a couple of months ago.
He was, yeah.
Yeah, and we had a great time with that group. It was really a great class. So I'm wondering, is this a type of RV? It's like a Bigfoot, a natural RVer. Because the communication, and it happens to different types of people, to children. They hear the Bigfoot encouraging them to come outside of the house. And when they tell the adults, they say, do you hear they're talking through the walls? Which happens to, no, they said, no, I can hear them in my head. It's exactly what Les Stroud said. You were asking earlier on about the evidence, the anecdotal evidence. When it all stacks up, these little kids have never talked to Les Stroud, and they're saying the same thing. You hear this from hikers and all sorts of different people, that they heard this voice in their head. Now, sometimes it sounds kind of mechanical, they say, almost computer-like. is it being translated by your mind into English, or do the Bigfoot speak English, which we're told that they can do a reasonable job of doing mimicry in the forest to convince you that they are one of your relatives or your dog out there? They're very good at imitating any animal or human type speech. We've heard their talk, by the way, from Ron Moorhead, who recorded it in the 70s in the High Sierras. It's called the Sierra Sounds. Anyone watching right now, just search for Sierra Sounds. You will hear what the Bigfoot sound like, talking back and forth to Ron in his hunting structure, which he had set up with a bunch of folks up in the National Forest there, or talking to each other, which some people call reverse samurai. It's a type of very fast language. The woman I dedicated the book to, Claire, who had a very kind of violent encounter with some of them at the Sea Otter Reserve near Carmel Heights, south of the town of Carmel in California. A British woman just happened to be there, a translator for a business meeting, goes out to take pictures of the coast, and the creatures come out and they see her when her camera lens drops or something, which often happens. And the male got very angry. The female Bigfoot were trying to calm the male down, but all she knows is she ended up back at her car. It charged her and she passed out, yelled, and it did things that other people see. It hit the ground. These are very common things that these Bigfoot do. Maybe it's a type of territorialism. She described that speech back and forth, really rapid. No one's decoded it. Even Scott Nelson, the crypto linguist from the Navy who worked with Ron Moorhead, people have wanted to know it. We know it's a language, but nobody knows what exactly they're saying. But they don't just speak their own language. They're apparently very good at mimicking human languages, whatever country they're in, passable. But they also have this telepathic ability, and that's what the listener's asking about. So they do have this ability to project their thoughts or something like that. I can't totally explain it, guys, into your mind. So, and people say they often, what they hear saying is they want the humans to come out of their trailer or their home and come out and meet for a meeting, whatever that would be. You can do that if you want. I mean, I don't know what I would do in that situation. It's a very persistent type of thought that shows up in your mind. And it's even a type of language. And they say other things too. And sometimes it's just, I'm no threat to you type of signaling, a variety of things. So what is that? It's a type of, it's a type of telepathy. It's a type of resonance where there maybe, so it gets into the second question here. And again, folks, I don't have all the answers. I have a lot of questions, and there do seem to be commonalities between these phenomena. So are we that closely related to them that we have sort of experiences that we have with other people in our lives, family members and stuff, where you sort of feel like you get thought transference just because you're on the same wavelength as a partner or a family member or a friend? You kind of get the feeling maybe they call, you know, that's them before you pick up the phone, that type of experience. So are we that closely related? Are we part of the same tree of life, and they are just a different branch? Or were we genetically modified by extraterrestrials or somebody so that we don't have those abilities anymore? I mean, again, this is going into speculation. We've all read stories and books about the history of the human species, and were we, manipulated by extraterrestrials to become gold miners in the past, Zachariah Sitchin and all that. I don't have the answer to it, but we're similar enough to them that we obviously don't have the amount of hair they have. We don't have the muscular development. People who see them say it's like looking at a cross between Arnold Schwarzenegger and Andre the Giant, or an NFL linebacker in fur. I mean, people describe them like being like bodybuilders, not super extreme bodybuilders that take steroids, but really, really chunky, as wide as a barn door. So we're different from them in many ways, but we're similar enough that we're obviously, go far enough back, we're related to them. So it's a really good question. Were we modified in some way? Andy, do they have abilities that we had at some point that were genetically modified out of us so that we're not naturally telepathic, or we have to take classes to remember how to do that?
Yeah.
It's a really good question. And I'm not certain of the answer.
As you say, I think the upbringing we have, especially in the Western world, through school and just our society, you lose a lot of what you have as a kid and that innocence. And do kids see other things? And
Yeah.
can kids see spirits? And who they play with. You see these videos online of usually babies sitting playing with something that's not even there. But so does that just go as you kind of pass on through childhood and into puberty and adulthood? And like you say, is it something that you relearn when you're older if you go to a class like yours,
Well,
or you read the right books? Or
I mentioned in Dark Matter Monsters seeing this PK demonstration in Japan. I went there a number of times to teach RV for a publishing company, and one of the students in the class, a surgeon, said, "You have to see this PK practitioner not far from Nagasaki." And I went there twice over 2 different visits, and this guy could really do PK. We've seen demonstrations of it. We know it's real. I mentioned in the book this case where I heard from someone who had worked in the Defense Department of the U.S. monitoring Soviet PK experiments back in the 70s, and knowing for a fact that it was real. Well, I've seen demonstrations of this, bottles being twisted, glass, obviously metal objects being twisted, but things levitating, things floating in the air that ended up in my shirt pocket, a cigarette in one case. There's no way. I'm thinking I'm seeing this thing floating, a cigarette above this practitioner's palm. I'm thinking, is it a string? I've got a mind like other people. I'm slightly skeptical. Is it a trick? Is there a mind? Well, the cigarette comes 15 feet across the room into my pocket. First try, boom, with force. It was the real thing. And I know that Sony had gone to, one of the CEOs of Sony was interested in psychic phenomena. He had filmed this guy with their fastest 10,000 frame second camera, I'm told by the person that was there at the time, who took my RV class. He said there were no strings, there were no tricks that they could detect. Even breaking each second down into 10,000 frames, they saw no signs of trickery. Well, does Bigfoot do this? Do they naturally know how to do PK? Because people have reported around them. The Russian researcher Igor Bortsev, who I corresponded with, and I talked to him at one of the conferences, he said when these creatures would come around their research van in Russia, former Soviet Union, things would start floating around. Is that intentional, or is that, again, a space-time sort of effect, a type of gravitational collapse? By gravitational collapse, we mean gravity ceasing to exist the way we know it, things staying down. Alexander Parkhomov, in his book, Space, Earth, Human, reported these sort of phenomena happening in the Soviet Union occasionally, where gravity would cease to exist for a few seconds and people would hit the tops of their apartments, things would float. And he attributed it to small black holes coming into the Earth's atmosphere. It's just one possibility. So do these creatures know how to modulate that in some way, create gravitational collapse? Are they natural PK masters? It's a reasonable question.
Absolutely. Interesting that as well. Like you say, some of these, even going back to talking about those injuries before, one of the debates someone was having online and questioned myself and Michael Masters on Twitter today, they were asking, if these are future humans, why are they coming back and harming us with technology they know would harm us, with radiation and burns and cancers? And well, maybe it's not deliberate, and maybe it's a consequence of the technology. And it's, just like nuclear material sitting on its own isn't trying to harm anyone. If you get close enough to it, a consequence of that kind of proximity is you may get radiation poisoning, sickness, burns, cancer. It just happens, and it's not deliberately trying to harm you, but it is harmful to you. So, yeah, like you say, maybe it's just a consequence of that proximity.
It's what Gary Nolan pointed out in his interview with Tucker Carlson. Yep, it could be just a consequence of the technology they're using, not intentional.
And final question from Catherine. Catherine had about 5 questions in one very quick paragraph. Quite a few of them you've answered already, but she says, "Hey, Simeon, what's with Bigfoot's purported ability to rapidly disappear? Do you think they're able to travel through portals or potentially dematerialize?"
Excellent question. Now, even last weekend, where I attended this Bigfoot Adventure weekend in Bailey, Colorado, and I'm really glad we're doing this interview now afterwards, the people talked about this experience, people who've seen it, and we heard stories, reports of this similar types of phenomena. One story I heard from one of the weekend organizers, Jim Myers, said, of the Sasquatch Outpost, which is sort of what was my introduction to this whole topic a number of years ago when I went to the museum in Bailey.
Mm-hmm.
He mentioned a group of hunters from Pennsylvania hearing something coming towards, and they told this to him in the store when we never told this to anyone, but something coming at them louder and louder. They have firearms with flashlights attached, to their firearms. At some point, they all raised their firearms with the flashlight with the intention of seeing what's running at them because they're getting really scared. And there's nothing there but a blue mist.
Mm-hmm.
Other people report just what the listener is saying. It's literally there 1 second and it's poof, it's gone. I remember hearing about a case like this from Igor Bortsev at the conference a couple of years ago in Bailey, 2021, just last year. And he talked about a case in a garden somewhere in Russia. This woman sees a Bigfoot walking towards her, and then she said it was like a curtain of light came down and it was just gone. And this has been reported a number of times. Sometimes people hear them walking around them in the woods or pacing them on the side perfectly as they take a step. They hear crunching sticks and leaves and it stops. But there's nothing there they can see, but they can see the ground getting pressed down. So again, this is exactly what Lockheed Martin talks about in their patent for coherent matter waves is invisibility and cloaking. So I'm just wondering, I think, again, it's kind of a reasonable connection to make. Is this a feature of coherent matter? Do the Bigfoot know how to work with this state of matter? I call it in the book, the fifth state of matter.
Yeah.
So that they can do exactly what our defense contractors are attempting to patent. And it's taken them a while to get approval from the patent office. Cloaking, invisibility. Is it the same, based on the same principles, or is it in something entirely different? But it does seem to be a feature, which is, again, another thing that makes it hard to talk about and even to get funding at the Defense Department, if you're an OSAP, to talk about things that can be there one moment. The dino beaver.
Yeah.
You and Dan have laughed about the dino beaver many times on this podcast.
Many folks have, yeah.
Yeah, this creature that looks like a pig, but it's the size of it's like a beaver, but with the stegosaurus, plates on its back, a huge beaver, and they go around the side. Two of the analysts go around the side of the building, nothing there. People have reported this around Bigfoot. I heard more reports about this even recently in other parts of the country where people had talked to loggers. I talked to a nurse that had talked to many loggers who had been doing this their whole lives. And they said, you'll never believe this. And I've never told anyone this, but sometimes we see them come out behind a tree, look at us. They go back behind the tree. When we go there, they're not there. So is this, again, type of life form that can morph, that can cloak? Are they there but are now invisible? The other thing, Andy, that's come up is that they can appear like saran wrap, which is you see a shimmer.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of causing a shimmering effect, like you see something's there between you and what's farther away, and it can turn into a Bigfoot. People have reported that, or vice versa. It's really fascinating. And again, it's one of the features of coherent matter is to be able to change so that light just passes through it. We know about metamaterials, which are materials that modify the wavelength of light because they're smaller than the wavelength of light, at a crystalline level, atomic level. But is this the same thing, or is this something entirely different? It's just a really good question and something I think about a lot.
Simeon, I'm glad the listeners covered such a breadth of topics on their questions, because I've barely scratched the surface of the book. There's 14 chapters. There's a whole lot of references in there. And thank you for myself and Dan for the acknowledgement at the start as well. That was a nice surprise to read. That was very nice.
Andy, none of us can do this alone. We all rely on each other to expand our sphere of understanding, right? And for instance, on your show here, I hear new things and new ideas from people like John Ramirez and all the other guests you've had, and other podcasts as well, that give me information, valuable information that I wouldn't hear anywhere else. So none of us are in a vacuum here. We're all working together, and each of us is kind of working in our own way. I'm really happy to say this book has been #1 in the category of electromagnetism for several days in the running. I mean, the entire physics category of electromagnetism which is astounding to have a book about these topics in electromagnetism, which means that people outside our field that, other people are seeing this now at the top of the list, and they're wondering, why is Bigfoot in electromagnetism? I mean, they must be furious, some of them. But look, these topics have an electromagnetic component, and it's just part and parcel of the whole territory. And it deserves to be, I think it deserves to be looked at more closely. To be looked at by regular scientists instead of pushing it away. And this is what we've been saying the whole show, and what you're always saying on this podcast. It's time for the stigma to be removed from these topics. Let's take a look at what's going on.
Absolutely. What do you want people's takeaway to be from this book? Is there one thing at the end of it you want everyone to go, do you know what? This is something I'm now going to consider.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, Andy. I think what I'd like people to do is realize they've had experiences with these phenomena that they may have forgotten about or just explained away. Often Bigfoot witnesses, you talk to them and they said, I thought those little tree structures were Boy Scouts in the forest near my home or vacation cottage out there, but I never saw any Boy Scouts, but I thought that's what was making the trees. Or those growling sounds at night were bears, or those weird smells was a skunk, or whatever experience you've had. I think what people need to do is take their experiences more seriously instead of doubting them and worrying about, ridicule, being laughed at by neighbors and friends. We all encounter that from time to time, kind of pushback against these topics. But I think the takeaway message would be, you might have had experience with these phenomena and not known about it. And secondly, we don't know as much as we think we do. It's to really have a healthy sense of curiosity, doubt about our existing paradigm, and curiosity towards what we don't know yet, and to kind of be humbled a little bit. And I think that's the effect of studying these topics myself on me, is to realize, even if you think you know so much and you've been going to conferences and studying this, you might only know a tiny percentage of the bigger story. And I think that's kind of exciting, isn't it? That there's so much more for us to discover. And that's really what it's all about.
Absolutely. And people can discover you and your work at various different places. I'll put all the links in the description to this podcast. But I would encourage folks, one way to quash that curiosity is pick up a copy of Dark Matter Monsters, Cryptids, Ball Lightning, and the Science of Secret Life Forms. It's available on Amazon, of course, in various formats. But again, if you can support your local booksellers or local bookstores, then please do that as well. But the main thing is pick up a copy, listen to it, read it, Kindle it, whatever you do. But let me know what your thoughts are. Simeon, it's always a pleasure speaking to you, and I look forward to having you back on in the near future.
Thanks, Andy. We'll talk again soon.
That is all for this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. You can like, retweet, and subscribe. That would all be very much appreciated. The shows are being uploaded onto YouTube as we speak more and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/That UFO podcast to access the shows ad-free as well. Please get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, That UFO podcast. Of course, on Twitter, it's at UFO UAPAM. And again, folks, as always, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little Baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little. Meditative game of state full on meta. Can't imagine how it could have been any better. I got to the top of the stairs and there he was. Like, you awake? I was about to abduct you, cuz. I jumped back and nearly kissed myself, and I climbed out the window after the elf, and I woke up in my bed and there was something on my head and everything was weird and everything was red. And I called out to my boys. They thought this was noise. They thought it was a dream. They thought it was my toys. They thought it was my problems, and they think I should seek therapy, and I don't know what to do because it doesn't really scare me. If you really want to know who I think I be, I think it's you and me and us and we and him and her and that and she and that thing over there and what's that, Jake?